This is lecture 10 for Biology 178, covering the cardiovascular system anatomy. So we started already with blood and we talked about the general functions of blood. Remember that the cardiovascular system consists of blood, the fluid transport system, a pump, which is the heart, and then of course the blood vessels within which the blood travels throughout the body. Now, the functions of the cardiovascular system are as follows. It circulates and distributes nutrients, so things like oxygen and glucose, as well as other proteins and lipid molecules. It removes wastes like CO2 and other waste byproducts, different nitrogenous products, bilirubin, etc. It is involved in communication. It does this by circulating hormones as well as other proteins and different signaling agents in the body. It is involved in regulation, specifically of body temperature, where it can be used to transfer body temperature or heat things up rather, or cool things down based upon the temperature of the blood. And it regulates muscle activity by sending more blood to that given muscle region. Finally, it's involved in protection in the form of antibodies or white blood cells, platelets to help with clotting, and other general immune system function. We'll start with the anatomy of the cardiovascular system by looking at the pump or the heart. Your heart is roughly the size of one's clenched fist. Larger individuals are going to typically have larger hearts. The heart consists of 4 chambers. It has 2 atria. These are going to be the small chambers up top and the 2 ventricles, which are larger chambers in the bottom. The heart pumps blood into 2 circuits. The pulmonary circuit is where blood is pumped from the heart to the lungs and then back to the heart in order to get oxygenated. And the systemic circuit is actually pumping blood to the entire body. So this is going to be pumping blood from the heart to the body and then back to the heart. Going out to the body, it's going to actually be giving oxygen, taking CO2 and waste and things like that, and then going back to the heart. In the pulmonary circuit, remember that it's actually going to be giving up CO2 and absorbing oxygen. So this is where it gets oxygenated, and the systemic circuit is where it delivers nutrients. The order of blood flow through the vessels goes heart to arteries, to arterioles, to capillaries, to venules, to veins, and then back to the heart. A quick note, arterioles are simply smaller arteries, and venules are simply smaller veins. Capillaries are going to be the smallest of all blood vessels, and they're actually only one cell thick, and they are where all exchange takes place in the body. So there's going to be exchange of gases, nutrients, etc. that take place in the capillaries. Here we can see the heart as it's centered in the chest. It's going to be roughly center, slightly sitting off to the left of the heart, with the apex or point of the heart pointing towards the top of the left hip. The base of the heart is going to be the widest portion of the heart. Notice all the blood vessels actually come off the top of the heart. The heart has several layers, and one of its outermost coverings is actually going to be a serous membrane called the pericardium. We've talked about this back in Biology 177. The pericardium is a fluid-filled sac that has a parietal lining that is away from the organ and the visceral lining that is touching the organ. This can be seen by when we have the fist in the balloon. The portion of the balloon that is touching the fist is representative of the visceral, and the portion that is away is representative of the parietal. Inside is fluid, and this pericardium is designed to reduce friction because the heart is always moving. And so with that movement, it's going to be moving up against other organs. And so that pericardial cavity is going to help reduce that friction. After we leave the pericardium, again, that fluid-filled sac that covers the heart, we get into the actual heart itself. The heart itself is composed of the myocardium. You can see multiple cardiac muscle cells here. This makes up the myocardial layer. The deepest layer, that's going to be the layer inside the chambers, is the endocardium. This is going to be a layer of endothelium and loose areolar connective tissue that is designed to prevent the transfer of gases or nutrients from the blood inside the chambers to the actual tissue of the heart. So that's going to be the different layers. From superficial to deepest layer, we have the pericardium, consisting of the parietal pericardium, and then the visceral pericardium, which is otherwise known of as the epicardium. Then it goes myocardium, and then it goes endocardium, and that's from superficial to deep. Here we have the superficial anatomy of the heart. The heart, like I said, consists of the two atria, which are up top, the right and left atria, and then the two ventricles at the bottom, right and left. Coming off the top of the heart, we have different vessels. Each chamber actually has a vessel that is attached to it. The right atrium is attached, in this case, as you can see, to the superior vena cava. It also has the inferior vena cava feed up through the bottom, so you can sometimes just remember that the vena cava attaches to the right atrium. The left atrium is actually going to be attached to the pulmonary vein. The right ventricle has the pulmonary trunk that comes off of it and bifurcates into the left and right pulmonary arteries. And the left ventricle is attached to the aorta. Here you can see the aorta is the largest artery that comes out through the middle, this large arch. The artery will then split off into multiple vessels. Here you can see the order of vessels: the brachiocephalic trunk, the left common carotid, and the left subclavian. These will further branch later on. This is a posterior view of the heart where you can actually see a few more structures. Here you can clearly see the left atrium with the left and right pulmonary veins that actually extend into the left atrium. We can also see the inferior vena cava on the back side, as well as another view of the right and left ventricles. So now we've opened up the heart and we can start to see some of the internal structures. We're going to start with the right atrium. Notice the right atrium has blue arrows pointing into it. This is because as blood travels from the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava towards the heart, it enters via the right atrium. From here, blood will move from the right atrium into the right ventricle, where it passes through the first of our valves, the right atrioventricular valve, meaning it separates the atrium from the ventricle, otherwise known of as the tricuspid valve, because it has three flaps. The tricuspid valve is held into place by the chordae tendineae. These are simply the heartstring structures that anchor the tricuspid valve directly to the walls of the heart. There's also papillary muscles inside, and all the ridges that you see, those are called trabeculae carneae. From the right ventricle, blood will get pumped out of the heart via the pulmonary trunk. The pulmonary trunk then bifurcates into the pulmonary arteries, which both head to the lungs. Separating the pulmonary trunk from the right ventricle, we can clearly see the pulmonary valve, otherwise known of as the pulmonary semilunar valve. This will separate the pulmonary trunk from the right ventricle, and the purpose of the valves is to ensure a one-way flow in the system. Blood will then travel back from the lungs via the red arrows to the left pulmonary veins in the back and enter the left atrium. From the left atrium, it will then pass into the left ventricle, where it passes through this next one of our valves, the left atrioventricular valve, or the mitral valve, also called the bicuspid valve. From here, the left ventricle will contract and pump blood out through the aorta, where it passes through, a little hard to see here, aortic semilunar valve or aortic valve. This is again separating the aorta from the left ventricle. Blood will then travel up through the aorta and out to the rest of the body. Also on this diagram, take note of the apex, which would be the very tip of the heart that's going to point down towards the left hip. An additional structure to note is the auricle. An auricle is an atrial appendage or small sac that is associated with each atria. It allows the actual sac to stretch a little bit more and to help fill with greater overall blood, and helps to increase pressure in the ventricles as well. Two other additional structures to cover are the fossa ovalis and the ligamentum arterosum. The ligamentum arterosum is simply a ligament structure that anchors the aorta to the pulmonary trunk and helps to make sure that they stay in place, because both of these vessels deal with a high pressure. So to create a connective tissue structure to anchor them in place really benefits the system. The fossa ovalis is actually a remnant of a hole in the heart. When you're actually in fetal state, blood will pass from the right atrium to the left atrium and not go to the lungs. This, of course, is because in fetal circulation, the air comes directly from the mother, so there's no need for the lungs to function for a fetus. This hole in the heart for a fetus is called the foramen ovale, as it says in your lecture notes. When you are born, this area closes up and it becomes the fossa ovalis, a small depression remnant of this hole. Here we can actually see a sample of the foramen ovale, and it's actually going to allow blood to pass from the right atrium to the left atrium in fetal circulation only. Again, once you're born, this hole seals up and becomes the fossa ovalis. So this is taking us through blood flow through the heart again, and this will be on the lecture page 2 of your notes. We go again, blood flow will travel from the vena cava down into the right atrium. From the right atrium, it passes by the tricuspid valve into the right ventricle. From the right ventricle, it's going to pass up through the pulmonary semilunar valve, and then out the pulmonary trunk to the pulmonary arteries. From there, it's going to head towards the lungs. Then it will come back from the lungs via the pulmonary veins, both left and right pulmonary veins, which will then come into, I'm at 4 now, the left atrium. The left atrium then pumps blood down past the mitral or bicuspid valve into the left ventricle. From the left ventricle, it will then pass up through the aortic semilunar valve and into the aorta. The aorta will pump it out to the body, and then the whole cycle starts all over again. So do you remember when I was talking about the layers of the heart and that internal structure of the heart called the endocardium? The endocardium, remember, is going to prevent the exchange of nutrients and gases from the actual chambers of the heart and into the myocardium. So if the heart tissue itself doesn't get nutrients from the blood in the chambers, then how does it get nutrients? Well, it gets that via the coronary blood vessel circulation system. The coronary blood vessels are blood vessels directly on the surface of the heart that supply blood to the heart muscles. They branch off from the ascending aorta near its base. So this is right at the origin of the aorta as it leaves the heart. So these are the first blood vessels to actually receive blood. From the actual base of this, it's going to branch off into the right and left coronary artery. The right and left coronary artery each branch off again, and then they return to the actual vena cava. Blood returns from the heart to the vena cava via the cardiac veins. In this diagram, we have removed the pulmonary trunk so that we can see the different coronary arteries and veins a little bit more clearly. So we can see the initial branches, the bases at which from the aortic arch they actually split off. The right coronary artery is going to branch off obviously towards the right side and then eventually head over to the back where it becomes the posterior interventricular artery. This will supply blood to the right atrium, the right ventricle, a little bit of the left atrium and ventricle, 1/3 of the interventricular septum, which is the space that divides the right and left ventricle and is composed of the myocardium, and then the SA and AV nodes. We haven't talked about those yet, but those are going to be the pacemakers of the heart. On the left side, we can see the left coronary artery that would actually pass directly behind the pulmonary trunk. Immediately after extending out and passing the pulmonary trunk, the left coronary artery bifurcates into the anterior interventricular artery, which we can see spread over the left ventricle, and then to the circumflex artery, which is going to extend around the heart on the left side towards the back. The left coronary artery and its branches supply blood to the left ventricle, left atrium, a little bit of the right ventricle, and the other 2/3 of the interventricular septum. Here we can see on the back side where the circumflex branch of the left coronary artery extends around the left atrium. Additionally, we can see the right coronary artery as it extends around the right side and then becomes the posterior interventricular branch of the right coronary artery. Blood flow of the heart back from the arteries towards the actual vena cava is going to move via the different cardiac veins that are going to be surrounding the heart. Each one of the cardiac veins actually shares its name directly with the artery that it's branched to. So for example, the posterior interventricular artery is going to have the posterior interventricular vein as well. These veins are all going to feed back to the great cardiac vein, which runs right next to the circumflex branch of the left coronary artery. The great cardiac vein will then reach the coronary sinus. The coronary sinus is the expanded end portion that actually inserts directly into the right atrium vena cava meeting up. And that's where blood will return from coronary circulation to the right atrium of the heart. Now, the heart requires an uninterrupted supply of oxygen and nutrients or it will die. Sometimes things go wrong. Arteriosclerosis is an arterial disease that begins with the formation of plaque of cholesterol, specifically LDLs, low-density lipoproteins. That's the quote-unquote bad cholesterol. This is followed by inflammation of the arterial wall, as seen here, that results in the narrowing of the artery with reduced elasticity. This will lead to an increased peak of blood pressure, and if the plaque is unstable, it can lead to acute problems and burst. This can occur in any artery in the body. The other type of problem, of course, is a myocardial infarction or a heart attack. This is when a coronary vessel becomes blocked either by a blood clot or by debris from the arteriosclerotic plaques. Blood supply to that portion of the heart is stopped and the cardiac cells die. The result depends upon the size of the vessel and the area being supplied, so how bad it is effectively. We can actually see in this dissection the scar tissue that is left over from dead myocardial cells. Normally myocardial cells are going to be deep dark red, whereas these are white and necrotic. Revisiting the valves of the heart a little bit, we're going to talk about how the valves work together. Remember that the general function of all valves is to ensure one-way blood flow in the heart. Here we can see the valves during ventricular diastole. Ventricular diastole, I know we haven't talked about it yet, is effectively the ventricles relaxed. So when the ventricles are relaxed, not pumping blood, the AV valves, or atrioventricular valves, specifically the tricuspid and bicuspid valves, are open. This is to allow blood to actually flow from the atria into the ventricles. Notice how the aortic valve and the pulmonary valve, otherwise known as the semilunar valves, are closed. This is going to be to help to build pressure in the ventricles and prevent blood from leaving the heart right now. When the heart moves to contract the ventricles to pump blood out of the heart towards the body and lungs, the AV valves will actually close and the semilunar valves will open. This is to, again, ensure one-way flow. The valves always work together so that when the bicuspid and tricuspid close, if one of them closes, the other one is guaranteed to be closed as well, unless something's broken. The valves always close and open together so that the sides of the heart always work together in unison. Remember that the right side of the heart is focused on pumping blood towards the lungs, whereas the left side of the heart focuses on pumping blood to the body. So right side is pulmonary circulation, left side is systemic circulation. We're now going to start moving into some of the physiology of the heart itself and start by talking about the cardiomyocytes. We'll start it here and then continue it in the next lecture. Cardiomyocytes are found only in the heart. They are the heart muscle cell. They are smaller than skeletal muscles, and they have a single centrally located nucleus, whereas skeletal muscles are multinucleated. Cardiomyocytes are highly branched, and their cells contain organized myofibrils in a striated appearance. So this actually makes them, the organized myofibrils makes them similar to skeletal muscle. The branching is a unique thing that we'll talk about in just a bit. The cells of these branched myocytes are going to be connected via intercalated discs. Intercalated discs consist of two types of junctions. The gap junction, if we remember, gap junctions are going to allow for the exchange of information across two cells, and anchoring junctions are desmosomes. These are going to be strong protein-based anchors that allow the cells to actually fuse to each other. The cardiomyocyte is almost totally dependent on aerobic metabolism for energy. So if there's ever an interruption in oxygen, cells start to die almost immediately. Here we can see the structure of the cardiomyocyte. Notice the actual branching of it and then the different junctions that we can see. We can see the gap junctions and the desmosomes in between these cells. Everything is linked up to where all of the myofibrils go together. Here we can actually see the intercalated discs on a histological view with the nuclei that are present in between the cells. We'll continue with the cardiomyocyte physiology and how the electrical system works in the heart in the next lecture.